France, August 1944. The sun was barely above the horizon when the low growl of engines began to echo through the Norman countryside. Mile after mile, convoys of olive-drab trucks rumbled eastward, their headlights dimmed, their tarps whipping in the wind, and the smell of gasoline hanging heavy in the air. The locals called it the Steel River, a living chain of machines that never seemed to stop. From the air, German reconnaissance pilots reported the same sight, endless streams of vehicles carving new roads across France. But this wasn't an invasion. It was the Red Ball Express, the lifeline of the Allied advance, and one of the most remarkable logistical operations in military history. Each of those trucks carried the fuel, ammunition, and rations that kept General George S. Patton's Third Army moving. Without them, his tanks, the fastest in Europe, would have stalled in days. With them, he tore through France at an unprecedented pace, outflanking retreating German forces and threatening to end the war before Christmas. The key wasn't just the number of men or machines, but the rhythm, the constant, relentless tempo of supply. When German technicians later examined captured convoy schedules and fuel depot maps, what they saw defied every principle they had been taught. Their own armies, masters of organization and precision, had built their logistics on rail lines, timetables, and static depots. But the Americans had created something entirely different, a system designed not for order, but for motion. In a report recovered from the files of the German Army High Command, one officer summarized the revelation in a single line. The American weapon was not their tank, nor their bomber. It was their ability to move. That realization came too late. The war in the West was already being reshaped, not by strategy alone, but by fuel, tires, and miles of road. The Red Ball Express would run day and night for 82 days straight, with more than 6,000 trucks thundering down narrow French highways marked only by red discs and dust clouds. For the men who drove them, it was exhaustion and danger without glory. For those who faced them, it was the visible proof that America's strength lay not only in firepower, but in speed. And as the German staff began to study the system in detail, they came to a sobering conclusion: the future of warfare belonged to those who could keep moving. In the summer of 1944, Europe was in flux. The Allies had broken through the Normandy hedgerows after weeks of grueling fighting, and the German front in France was collapsing faster than anyone expected. What began as a cautious beachhead in June had become, by late August, a full-scale pursuit across the French countryside. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's Supreme Command had one pressing concern: how to keep the army supplied as they advanced at a rate the planners themselves hadn't predicted. Fuel was the new currency of war. Each tank, truck, and jeep burned through it faster than the supply chain could deliver. The Allied advance was moving so quickly that the ports they depended on, Cherbourg, Le Havre, and eventually Antwerp, either lay in ruins or were still under enemy control. Every mile forward stretched the supply lines thinner. What began as a triumph of strategy was becoming a test of endurance. In the words of Major General Charles P. Gross, Chief of the Transportation Corps, no army ever advanced faster or farther on wheels than ours did in France, and no army ever came so close to running out of gasoline. The logistical planners of the European theater faced a dilemma that could have halted the campaign. Patton's Third Army was pushing east faster than its fuel depots could follow, while the First and Ninth Armies were competing for the same scarce resources. The invasion beaches at Normandy still held mountains of supplies, but those reserves were useless unless they could be moved inland. The answer came from an idea that seemed almost reckless: to create a nonstop trucking route that would operate 24 hours a day, carrying high-priority supplies directly from the beaches to the front lines. the system would abandon traditional depot-based logistics and instead run on speed, improvisation, and human endurance. It would not rely on railways, which were vulnerable to bombing or sabotage, but on motor convoys, an innovation on a scale no army had ever attempted. On August 25, 1944, the Red Bull Express was officially born. The name came from a term used in the U.S. railroad industry, where Red Bull referred to fast freight lines given absolute priority. The principle was simple: once a Red Bull convoy was on the road, nothing could stop it. Civilian traffic was banned from its routes, and military police guarded every intersection. Within days, the operation assembled over 6,000 vehicles, mostly the rugged GMC CCKW Deuce and a Half trucks and Studebaker 2.5-ton haulers. Each could carry up to 5 tons of cargo, ranging from fuel drums and ammunition crates to spare tank parts. Drivers operated in rotating shifts, sleeping in their cabs between runs. The convoys followed a strict one-way circuit. Loaded trucks traveled east to the forward supply depots, while empty ones returned west to reload. To prevent confusion, the routes were marked with red circular signs, the Red Bulls that gave the express its name. The men who drove these convoys came from the U.S. Army's Quartermaster and Transportation Corps, and most were African American soldiers. Under the segregated system of the time, black troops were largely assigned to support roles, often denied the recognition given to combat units. But the Red Bull Express made them indispensable. Of its 23,000 drivers, roughly 75% were African American, men who endured exhaustion, long hours, and danger with little acknowledgement from the army they served. As one driver later recalled in an oral history recorded at the U.S. Army Transportation Museum, "We weren't heroes, but we kept Patton moving. If the truck stopped, the tank stopped. And if the tank stopped, the war stopped." The routes were perilous. Narrow French roads, still cratered from retreating German demolitions, became slick with mud in the autumn rains. Drivers faced air raids, ambushes, and mechanical failures that could leave them stranded for hours. Yet the convoys moved like clockwork, guided by luminous paint on signposts and strict radio silence to avoid detection. The sheer scale of coordination was unprecedented. Maintenance depots were set up along the route, manned by mechanics working under floodlights. Tire repair units operated roadside pits, replacing hundreds of tires daily. Refueling was handled by mobile fuel tankers that met convoys en route. Field kitchens were established every 50 miles. The road system became, in effect, a living organism, self-sustaining, adaptable, and always in motion. German reconnaissance units quickly noticed the phenomenon. Aerial photographs taken by Luftwaffe scouts showed highways clogged with Allied trucks moving east in endless columns. At first, German commanders dismissed it as temporary chaos, the disorganization of an advancing army. But by mid-September, reports confirmed that the Allies had built a deliberate, large-scale supply network that operated with stunning efficiency. To the Germans, it was incomprehensible. Their own logistics system had been built on centralization, precise rail timetables, detailed manifests, and fixed depots close to the front. The Americans had replaced that with something dynamic, a constantly shifting flow that could reroute itself in hours. As captured after action reports later revealed, German analysts began to realize that what they were witnessing wasn't just transport, it was strategy. The ability to move faster than an enemy could react was becoming a weapon in itself. In the words of one post-war German staff officer, recorded in 1946, "We fought the Americans as if they were an army. But what defeated us was their industry, and the speed with which it could deliver itself to the battlefield." The Red Ball Express was more than a supply system. It was the industrial age turned into motion, the assembly line extended onto the battlefield. And as the Germans would soon discover, its power lay not in perfection, but in perpetual movement. By early September 1944, the Red Ball Express had transformed from a desperate experiment into the beating heart of the Allied advance. What began as a hastily organized convoy system was now a vast, coordinated network stretching nearly 700 miles across France. From the beaches of Normandy to the fuel depots of Chartres and Droz, and onward to the spearheads driving toward Belgium, thousands of trucks moved in an unbroken rhythm, a choreography of steel, fuel, and human endurance. Every element of the operation had been refined through experience. The routes themselves were divided into two main corridors, one for eastbound loaded trucks and another for the returning empties. These roads were marked with distinctive red and blue discs nailed to trees, telephone poles, and ruins, visible even under blackout conditions. At night, the headlights of the convoys were dimmed to narrow slits, and drivers followed glowing strips of luminous paint or reflective tape fixed to the road. From above, the highways glowed faintly, a ribbon of ghostly light stretching across the countryside. To keep the traffic flowing, the U.S. Army's military police established control points at key junctions, directing vehicles with hand signals and lanterns. Any non-essential military or civilian vehicle caught on the route could be seized or pushed off the road. The Red Ball routes had the highest traffic priority in Europe. A trucking convoy had more authority than a tank division en route. The organization behind it was staggering. Each convoy was assigned a code number, departure time, and priority cargo list. Most carried gasoline, stored in 55-gallon drums and stacked high under canvas tarps. Others hauled artillery shells, spare tank treads, or field rations. The convoys were dispatched in intervals of minutes, maintaining a constant flow so that the last truck of one column would pass the same point just as the first of the next arrived. At the heart of this machine were the drivers. Young, often barely trained, they drove day and night on minimal sleep, surviving on cold rations and coffee. Many were African American soldiers from quartermaster truck companies, segregated units who found themselves performing one of the most vital roles of the entire campaign. They nicknamed their trucks rolling coffins, because a blown tire, a stray mine, or an ambush could end the journey instantly. Still, morale remained remarkably high. As one driver recalled, "We didn't stop for rain, we didn't stop for bombs. If you broke down, another truck pushed you until you got rolling again." Maintenance was constant. Along the route, mobile repair teams set up roadside service stations under tents or open skies. Mechanics worked around the clock, fixing axles, patching tires, and replacing broken springs. When parts ran out, they scavenged from wrecks. Fuel dumps were positioned at intervals so that trucks could refuel without halting the convoy. Even the food system was optimized. Mobile field kitchens prepared hot meals, and soldiers would grab them from mess tents without leaving their trucks. The convoys soon became so efficient that Allied commanders began depending on them for everything, from munitions to mail. On average, over 12,000 tons of supplies were delivered daily, equivalent to a fully loaded Liberty ship arriving every 24 hours. Yet behind the impressive figures lay exhaustion. The driver's shift stretched up to 16 hours a day. Trucks were overloaded, brakes worn thin, and accidents frequent. The roads, once rural lanes, were never meant to handle such weight. Despite these hardships, the system worked. As Patton's armored columns charged toward the Moselle River, their tanks were refueled directly from Red Bull trucks at roadside dumps. Engineers built makeshift fuel points where gasoline drums were rolled off trucks and siphoned directly into vehicles. "We fought our battles by the barrel," Patton later said, and the Red Ball boys brought the barrels. German intelligence, meanwhile, was trying to make sense of the phenomenon. Aerial photographs showed lines of traffic stretching beyond the horizon, yet Luftwaffe analysts struggled to understand how the Allies were sustaining their speed. Reports from German ground units described ceaseless motor traffic on certain roads, with no pattern of rest or rotation. Some commanders assumed the Allies were consuming their reserves recklessly, a costly misjudgment that shaped later counterattacks. When Wehrmacht reconnaissance patrols captured abandoned U.S. vehicles near Chartres and Chalons, they found route maps, schedules, and cargo manifests detailing an entire logistical system that operated without pause. It was unlike anything they had built, a decentralized, flexible supply chain that responded to real-time battlefield demands. German logisticians, trained to plan weeks in advance, were astonished to see convoys dispatched hourly based on radio updates from the front. One captured American driver, interrogated near Nancy, told his captors that his orders were simple: keep rolling east, no matter what. That phrase, noted in the report of a German intelligence officer, became a kind of symbol for the Allied campaign, relentless motion as doctrine. In one internal Wehrmacht analysis dated October 1944, later discovered in the Bundesarchiv at Freiburg, the author concluded, "The Americans have industrialized the art of supply. Where we calculate, they improvise. Where we conserve, they expend. Their system is not elegant, but it is inexhaustible." That observation was not exaggeration. In just 6 weeks, the Red Ball Express had delivered over 300,000 tons of supplies across northern France, enough to fuel the Third Army's advance all the way to the German border. Yet the system was reaching its limits. Roads were deteriorating, trucks were breaking down faster than they could be repaired, and manpower was stretched thin. Still, the convoys continued. To the German eye, it seemed impossible, an enemy that moved as if distance no longer mattered. And as captured officers would later write in disbelief, the American army had turned mobility into a weapon of its own. By mid-September 1944, the Red Ball Express had become an unstoppable engine of motion, a machine so vast that it seemed to defy its own limits. What had started as a logistical improvisation was now a full-scale operation involving more than 23,000 personnel, nearly 6,000 trucks, and an entire command structure dedicated to keeping the flow alive. Yet beneath its efficiency lay chaos, organized chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Convoy schedules were drawn up daily at the Advanced Section, ADSEC, headquarters of the Communications Zone, the administrative body overseeing logistics for the European theater. Officers planned each run with the precision of an orchestra conductor, calculating routes, load priorities, and refueling intervals. But once the trucks left the depots, control gave way to improvisation. Bridges collapsed, rain turned the roads into rivers of mud, and French civilians wandered across the lanes scavenging wreckage. And still, the convoys rolled. In the words of Captain John Houston, a Transportation Corps officer, we were moving faster than the maps could keep up. Sometimes, we didn't even know if the front line had shifted by the time the trucks arrived. Each convoy was a living system. At its head, a lead jeep set the pace. Behind it, dozens of trucks followed at fixed intervals. A single breakdown could block the entire column, so every convoy included mechanics with spare parts riding in the rear. If a truck couldn't be repaired quickly, it was pushed aside and cannibalized for parts. The goal was never perfection, it was motion. The human toll was immense. Drivers faced 18-hour shifts, often navigating blackout conditions with no headlights, their only guides the dim glow of the truck ahead. They ate from tins, drank bitter coffee, and slept wherever they stopped, sometimes in their cabs, sometimes on the ground beside the tires. Some trucks carried messages scrawled in chalk across their hoods: "No gas, no guns," or "We deliver or die trying." The pressure from above was unrelenting. Patton's Third Army, advancing at a record pace, burned through 500,000 gallons of fuel per day. Each gallon had to come from a truck. In a single 24-hour period in September, the Red Ball Express delivered 12,342 tons of supplies, the equivalent of 60 fully loaded freight trains. But this triumph was sustained only by the men at the wheel, many of whom had never been trained for such endurance. Mechanical fatigue became their constant enemy. Brakes overheated on mountain grades, transmissions failed under excess weight, and tires shredded on the coarse French gravel. At any given time, nearly a quarter of the trucks were sidelined for repairs. Yet the system adapted. Maintenance platoons established forward workshops using salvaged enemy equipment, welding stations, and improvised tools. The operation became a rolling factory, production on wheels. Meanwhile, German command began to study this phenomenon more closely. At the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, captured maps and logistics papers were analyzed by staff officers trying to understand how the Allies maintained such operational momentum. One report from late 1944, later declassified by the U.S. Army Historical Division, noted that American supply functions independently of rail. This gives them a tactical fluidity beyond our capacity. To the German technicians reviewing these documents, the Red Ball Express represented a new kind of warfare. It wasn't about superiority of weapons or tactics, it was about tempo. American divisions moved faster than their opponents could reorganize. Supply no longer followed the front, it was the front. Even when fuel shortages struck in early October, caused by overstretched ports and bomb-damaged pipelines, the Red Ball Express continued to function. Gasoline was rationed, but priority shipments kept Patton's spearheads alive. When tankers could not reach depots, the drivers themselves became the final link in the chain, unloading drums directly into combat vehicles under artillery fire. One remarkable account, preserved in the archives at Fort Eustis, describes a convoy reaching the outskirts of Metz under bombardment. The men refused to turn back. Instead, they formed a defensive circle of trucks and continued pumping fuel into tanks through the night. By dawn, Patton's columns were moving again. For the Germans, this defied logic. Their own transport columns, vulnerable to Allied air attacks and fuel starvation, had been reduced to fragments. Yet the Americans kept coming. It was as if the enemy had endless reserves, one captured Wehrmacht officer told his interrogators. They never stopped to build supply bases, they brought their bases with them. The system was not without cost. Between August and November 1944, hundreds of drivers were killed or injured in accidents and attacks. Convoy collisions were frequent, and some trucks simply disappeared into the darkness, never to be seen again. But to the men who survived, it was a point of pride, a war fought not with rifles, but with gears and gasoline. By the time the Red Ball Express reached its peak, it had become more than a logistical route, it was a symbol of American industrial might in motion. Every drum, every tire, every exhausted driver was part of a single machine, a machine that refused to stop. By the third week of September 1944, the great river of trucks that had powered the Allied advance began to slow. The Red Ball Express had carried Patton's tanks across France in record time, but now, the same speed that had fueled victory was threatening to consume itself. The armies had outrun their own lifeline. Supply depots were still hundreds of miles behind. The ports at Le Havre and Antwerp were either wrecked or under siege, and the French rail network remained crippled from years of occupation and bombing. What had once been triumphal momentum was now approaching exhaustion. The fuel situation was critical. Patton's Third Army, advancing faster than any in modern history, was suddenly halted near the Moselle River. His tanks sat idle, their engines cold, waiting for gasoline that was still hours, sometimes days, away. "My men can eat their belts," he said bitterly, "but my tanks have got to have gas." Eisenhower's headquarters faced an impossible arithmetic. Every division advancing eastward multiplied the fuel required to keep it moving. To maintain pace, the Red Ball Express would have needed to double its output, but the roads, the drivers, and the vehicles were already at their limit. Convoys now ran around the clock, often without pause for maintenance. Trucks that had once averaged 50 miles per hour were crawling at 20. Rain turned the highways into mud, and the constant traffic destroyed the surfaces. By mid-September, over 300 trucks per day were being lost to mechanical failure. Yet still, the flow continued. "We couldn't stop," one driver recalled. "If you stopped, the next truck hit you." The road itself was alive. The exhaustion spread through every level of the operation. Mechanics worked under floodlights for 18-hour shifts, scavenging parts from wrecked vehicles. Drivers dozed behind the wheel, snapping awake at the sound of gunfire or the crash of another truck rolling into a ditch. Some convoys were ambushed by German stragglers or strafed by low-flying aircraft. But the greatest enemy was fatigue and the sheer wear of distance. At the same time, German intelligence was taking notice. Field reports from Panzergruppe West described a continuous thunder of enemy transport echoing through the night, a noise that never ceased. Commanders in the field, confused by the scale of American movement, began to suspect a deception operation, that the Allies were feigning strength by constantly moving the same convoys back and forth. It was only when German patrols captured fragments of supply schedules and route orders that the truth became clear. The Americans were not recycling their forces, they were resupplying them in real time. In October 1944, a series of captured documents from abandoned U.S. field depots gave German analysts their first complete picture of the Red Ball Express. They discovered detailed timing sheets, fuel consumption records, and convoy departure logs. Each route was planned to the minute, with one-way traffic enforced by military police and dedicated maintenance zones spaced along the corridor. It was, as one German officer described, a pipeline on wheels. To the German staff, the revelation was sobering. Their own armies, dependent on railroads and fixed depots, had lost flexibility. The destruction of France's rail network, a deliberate Allied strategy, now seemed less like sabotage and more like prelude. The Americans had eliminated the infrastructure the Wehrmacht relied on, and replaced it with one that could not be bombed into paralysis. Even if roads were destroyed, the Americans simply built new ones. An intercepted report from the 116th Panzer Division, dated October 18, recorded the growing despair. Enemy armor receives constant resupply from motorized columns. Ammunition and gasoline arrive faster than our reconnaissance can report their needs. Their front has no rear. The phrase "their front has no rear" captured the German frustration perfectly. In conventional warfare, the rear area, depots, rails, warehouses, defined an army's reach. The Red Ball Express had blurred that boundary. The Americans could project power as far as their trucks could drive, and that distance expanded daily. Yet inside the Allied command, the strain was undeniable. By October, maintenance failures, driver exhaustion, and overused equipment forced a gradual reorganization. Secondary routes, nicknamed White Ball and Green Diamond, were created to relieve congestion, but none matched the intensity of the original Red Ball. Supplies were rerouted through the newly captured port of Antwerp, and engineers began constructing pipelines to reduce dependency on road transport. Still, the Germans remained fixated on what they had witnessed. In post-war interrogations, several Wehrmacht logisticians described the Red Ball Express as a weapon of motion, something that defied their doctrine of measured advance and calculated supply. To them, it was the industrialization of warfare's most ancient truth: the army that moves faster wins. By November 1944, the Red Ball Express was finally winding down. Winter rains turned roads into rivers of mud, and new supply systems, including the Pluto pipeline and restored railways, took over. But for those few months, the operation had rewritten the rules of logistics. It had shown that mobility itself could be a form of power. And for the German technicians who studied the captured plans, that understanding came with a quiet dread. The war had entered a new age, one where battles were decided not just by generals or guns, but by engines, fuel drums, and the men who refused to stop driving. By mid-November 1944, the great convoys of the Red Ball Express finally began to fade from the French roads they had dominated for nearly 3 months. The trucks, their engines worn down and their drivers hollow-eyed from exhaustion, rolled into the final depots one by one. The roads that had once thundered with motion grew quiet. The operation officially ended on November 16, replaced by new supply routes feeding from the restored ports of Antwerp and Le Havre, and by the Pluto, the undersea pipeline under the ocean, pumping fuel directly from Britain to the continent. Yet even as the trucks were parked and the red route markers torn down, the legacy of the Red Ball Express was only beginning. The operation had transported more than 412,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, and supplies across northern France, nearly half of all material delivered to the front during the Allied advance from Normandy to the German border. What had begun as an improvisation had become a doctrine, one that reshaped how armies thought about movement, supply, and speed. After the war, both the Allies and the defeated Germans studied the operation in meticulous detail. The U.S. Army's Transportation Corps, Operations Overseas, published in 1957 as part of the official Green Book series, called the Red Ball Express the most spectacular achievement of motor transport in military history. But in Germany, the reaction was more philosophical. Captured Wehrmacht officers, especially those from logistics branches, were instructed by Allied intelligence to write technical evaluations of the campaigns they had fought. Dozens of these reports, now preserved in the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg, reveal a recurring theme: the Red Ball Express was seen as proof that American warfare had transcended traditional logistics. One former staff officer wrote in 1946, "We understood combat, the Americans understood motion. They applied industrial organization to war." This realization had a profound impact on post-war military theory. When the Bundeswehr was established in 1955, its logistical doctrine borrowed heavily from the American model, emphasizing mobility, motorization, and decentralized resupply. The lessons learned from analyzing the Red Ball Express became foundational in NATO planning throughout the Cold War. In exercises conducted in West Germany during the 1960s, supply convoys were modeled directly on the 1944 operations in France. The Americans had demonstrated that mobility was not merely an advantage, it was survival. Within the U.S. Army, the success of the Red Ball Express validated the role of the Transportation Corps as an independent command branch. Officers who had cut their teeth on the operation, men like Colonel Lauren Ayers and Brigadier General Ewart Plank, went on to redesign the Army's logistics system for the jet age. Many of the principles that sustained the Red Ball Express, real-time dispatching, mobile repair units, and 24-hour convoy rotation, were institutionalized as doctrine by 1948. These methods would later influence the massive logistical undertakings of the Berlin airlift and, decades later, the motorized convoy systems of Korea and Vietnam. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation came in recognition of the men who made it possible. For decades, the contributions of the mostly African-American truck companies had gone largely unacknowledged. In the segregated Army of 1944, they had been given few opportunities for frontline service. Yet in the Red Ball Express, they became indispensable, responsible for keeping the world's largest mechanized army in motion. In 1992, the U.S. Army officially recognized the service of these drivers, many of whom had returned home without medals or formal honors. At the Transportation Museum in Fort Eustis, Virginia, an exhibit was dedicated to them, displaying faded convoy signs and photographs of the men beside their mud-caked trucks. On one placard is a quote from Staff Sergeant Warren Hughes, a former Red Ball driver. "We were the link in the chain. You can have the finest tanks and planes, but without fuel, you've got nothing. We gave them the fuel, and we gave it fast." In the years following the war, the Red Ball Express also influenced civilian industry. Trucking companies across the United States studied its methods, adapting convoy discipline and long-haul scheduling for peacetime logistics. What had begun as a desperate wartime measure had evolved into a model for post-war industrial transport. The highways of the 1950s, the era of the interstate, carried within them the DNA of the Red Ball Express. For the Germans who examined it after the war, the operation remained a haunting reminder of what they had faced in 1944. In one of the final intelligence analyses written by former Wehrmacht staff, the author summarized the lesson in plain terms. The Americans won not because they destroyed more, but because they moved more. The Red Ball Express had shown that logistics, long the invisible backbone of warfare, could itself become a weapon. Its success was not measured in miles or tonnage alone, but in its effect on the enemy's perception that the United States could move faster, longer, and farther than anyone else. By the end of 1944, the roads of France were scarred and rutted, but they bore the memory of something extraordinary, a force that never stopped, a movement that seemed infinite. And for the men who witnessed it, both friend and foe, it proved one enduring truth: wars may begin with firepower, but they are won by fuel and the will to keep going. The Red Ball Express ended as suddenly as it began. But its rhythm, the endless hum of engines rolling through the night, echoed long after the war was over. It was the sound of an army learning that speed itself could conquer continents. When the war ended in 1945, Europe's roads fell silent once more. The columns of trucks that had carried the Allied armies across France were gone, their engines dismantled, their drivers scattered back to civilian life. The Red Ball Express faded into history, overshadowed by the great battles it had supplied. But for those who had lived it, the men who drove, repaired, guarded, and planned it, the memory never disappeared. It remained as a hum beneath the triumphs of victory, a reminder that the true miracle of modern warfare wasn't only in the battles won, but in how they were sustained. Many of the German officers who survived the war continued to write post-war analyses for Allied military historians. Their reports, now preserved in archives, carried a tone of reluctant admiration. One logistics planner wrote, "We underestimated the American army because we believed they needed railways. We did not understand that they had replaced them with wheels." That single sentence summarized what the Red Ball Express had revealed, a transformation not only in transport, but in the philosophy of war itself. The Americans had turned movement into strategy. For the men who had driven those endless miles, the experience was personal. Most were barely out of their teens, young soldiers thrust into a mission that demanded endurance over heroism. They drove through the night, through rain and artillery fire, through exhaustion and mechanical failure, carrying the lifeblood of the front lines. Their battlefield was the road. Few medals were awarded, and few names recorded in dispatches. Yet without them, the great offensives, the liberation of Paris, the crossing of the Rhine, and the final push into Germany would have been impossible. Decades later, when historians began to study the war's logistics in depth, the story of the Red Ball Express returned to light. Veterans shared their accounts in interviews and memoirs, their words carrying both pride and weariness. "We weren't looking for glory," one recalled, "we just knew they couldn't fight without us." In their stories, the war was not about victories or defeats, but about motion, the sound of engines, the smell of diesel, the rhythm of convoys rolling through fog and darkness. At Fort Eustis, where the U.S. Army Transportation Museum stands today, one of the original Red Ball trucks is displayed under soft light. Its olive paint is faded, its tires cracked, its metal scarred with rust. A small plaque nearby bears a simple inscription, "They kept them moving." Visitors who stand before it see not just a vehicle, but an idea, the embodiment of a lesson that shaped the modern world. Because the Red Ball Express did more than move supplies. It proved that in an age of machines, time itself could be weaponized. Every mile saved, every gallon delivered, every repaired tire meant another advance, another bridge crossed, another step toward victory. The Germans, who once prided themselves on precision, realized too late that the Americans had found strength in momentum, in systems that never stopped, even when logic said they should. By the time the war ended, the phrase "speed is the weapon" had entered the vocabulary of both armies. It was not a metaphor. It was the truth written in fuel and steel. The Red Ball Express had turned logistics into the art of velocity, a lesson that would echo through every modern conflict thereafter, from Korea supply convoys to the armored highways of Desert Storm. And yet, for all its scale, the story remains profoundly human. It is the story of men who drove through fear and fatigue, who learned that victory sometimes means simply refusing to stop. It is the story of a nation whose greatest strength lay not in its weapons, but in its will to move forward, no matter the cost. As one German engineer wrote after the war, reflecting on the captured convoy maps, "They did not march on us, they flowed toward us." History remembers the guns, the tanks, and the battles. But beneath them all was the steady hum of engines, a sound that, for a brief moment in 1944, carried the weight of an entire army. Because sometimes, as the German technicians finally understood, the real weapon is not fire or steel, it is motion itself.